The millionaire fired her years ago. Today she bought his company. Get ready to witness one of the most incredible stories of perseverance, determination, and ultimate justice you've ever heard. Hit that like button right now, subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories, and don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment of what's about to unfold. Now, let's dive into this extraordinary story that will remind you why you should never give up on yourself. Chapter 1. The Betrayal. The rain was hammering against the windows of Sterling Financial Group's 38th floor conference room as Victoria Martinez sat across from CEO Jonathan Sterling, the man she had considered not just her boss, but her mentor for the past 5 years. At 28, Victoria had risen faster through the company ranks than anyone in its 50-year history, transforming from an entry-level analyst to senior vice president of strategic development through a combination of brilliant insights, relentless work ethic, and an uncanny ability to spot profitable opportunities that others missed. But today, something was different. Jonathan's usual warm demeanor had been replaced by cold professionalism, and the other executives in the room seemed unable to meet her eyes. Victoria had been called to what she thought was a routine quarterly review, but the atmosphere felt more like a trial where the verdict had already been decided. "Victoria," Jonathan began, his voice carrying none of the mentorship and encouragement that had characterized their relationship for years, "we need to discuss some significant changes to the company's strategic direction." Sterling Financial Group was a mid-sized investment firm based in Chicago that specialized in identifying and developing emerging market opportunities. Under Victoria's leadership, the Strategic Development Division had generated over $40 million in profits over the past 2 years, making it one of the most successful departments in the company's history. She had personally orchestrated deals that had elevated Sterling Financial from a regional player to a nationally recognized firm. "I'm excited to hear about the new direction," Victoria replied, genuinely enthusiastic about what she assumed would be an expansion of her responsibilities. "The portfolio analysis I completed last month identified several sectors where we could increase our market presence significantly." But instead of discussing growth opportunities, Jonathan slid a manila folder across the polished conference table. Victoria opened it to find documents that made her blood run cold, a termination agreement, severance papers, and a non-compete clause that would prevent her from working in the financial industry for 2 years. "I don't understand," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper as she stared at the papers. "Is this some kind of mistake?" "Victoria, you've been an asset to this company," Jonathan said, with the practiced tone of someone who had delivered this speech before. "But we're restructuring our operations to focus on more traditional investment strategies. The board has decided that your position is no longer necessary." The words hit Victoria like physical blows. For 5 years, she had poured her heart and soul into Sterling Financial Group. She had worked 16-hour days, sacrificed weekends and vacations, and dedicated herself completely to the company's success. She had turned down job offers from larger firms because she believed in the vision she was building with Jonathan and his team. "Jonathan, my division generated $40 million in profits last year," Victoria protested, finding her voice despite the shock. "We're the most successful department in the company. How can you say my position isn't necessary?" "The decision has been made," Jonathan replied curtly, avoiding eye contact. "We're prepared to offer you a generous severance package, 6 months' salary, plus benefits, but we need your resignation letter by the end of the day." Victoria looked around the conference room, at the other executives who had been part of countless strategy meetings, where her ideas had been praised and implemented. Not one of them would look at her directly. The betrayal was complete and devastating. "This is about the Morrison deal, isn't it?" Victoria said, her shock beginning to transform into anger. "You're pushing me out because I refused to support that acquisition." 3 weeks earlier, Victoria had strongly opposed the company's proposed acquisition of Morrison Industries, a struggling manufacturing company that Jonathan had wanted to purchase. Victoria's analysis had shown that Morrison was hiding significant environmental liabilities and outdated infrastructure that would make the acquisition a financial disaster. When she had presented her findings to the board, Jonathan had been furious, claiming that she was being overly cautious and lacking vision. Your concerns about Morrison were noted, Jonathan said stiffly, but sometimes leadership requires making decisions that others might not understand. Leadership requires listening to analysis and making informed decisions, Victoria shot back, her professional composure beginning to crack. Morrison Industries will bankrupt any company foolish enough to acquire it. The environmental cleanup alone will cost more than their reported assets are worth. That's enough, Jonathan said, his voice rising. The decision about your employment has been made. You can leave with dignity and a positive reference, or we can make this difficult for everyone involved. Victoria stared at the man she had once respected and admired, realizing that she had never really known him at all. For 5 years, she had believed they were building something meaningful together, but now she understood that she had always been expendable, a useful tool that could be discarded when it became inconvenient. I helped build this company, Victoria said quietly, her voice steady despite the rage and hurt she was feeling. Every major deal we've closed in the past 3 years came from my strategic recommendations. You're making the biggest mistake of your career. Your contributions have been appreciated, Jonathan replied with dismissive finality. But it's time for you to move on to new opportunities. Victoria stood up slowly, gathering the termination papers with hands that were remarkably steady, considering the earthquake that was happening inside her chest. She looked around the conference room. One last time, memorizing the faces of people who had smiled at her in countless meetings, while apparently planning her professional execution. You're right about one thing, Jonathan, she said as she reached the door. It is time for me to move on to new opportunities, and when I do, you're going to regret this decision for the rest of your career. With that, Victoria Martinez walked out of Sterling Financial Group for what everyone in that conference room assumed would be the last time. But as she rode the elevator down 38 floors, her mind was already working on plans that would eventually bring her back to this building under very different circumstances. The rain was still falling when Victoria stepped onto the Chicago sidewalk, but she no longer felt its sting. Instead, she felt something that would sustain her through the difficult years ahead, a burning determination to prove that the biggest mistake Jonathan Sterling had ever made was underestimating her. 5 years of loyalty and dedication had been rewarded with betrayal and dismissal, but Victoria Martinez was about to discover that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of a much better one. If you're already invested in Victoria's journey and want to see how she transforms this devastating setback into ultimate victory, make sure you've hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Trust me, what happens next will absolutely blow your mind. Chapter 2. The Foundation, 6 months. After her termination from Sterling Financial Group, Victoria Martinez found herself in a studio apartment in Denver, Colorado, living on her dwindling severance money and fighting to rebuild her career from the ground up. The non-compete clause that Jonathan Sterling had forced her to sign meant she couldn't work for any financial services company for 2 years, effectively blacklisting her from the industry where she had built her expertise and reputation. But Victoria had not spent those months in despair. Instead, she had used the time to analyze what had gone wrong at Sterling Financial and to develop a comprehensive plan for her professional comeback. If the traditional financial industry was closed to her, she would create her own path into it. Her small apartment was transformed into a makeshift research center with financial publications, industry reports, and market analysis covering every available surface. Victoria had always been brilliant at identifying emerging market opportunities, and now she was applying that same analytical skill to her own situation. The breakthrough came when she realized that the non-compete clause, while preventing her from working for existing financial companies, said nothing about starting her own business in adjacent markets. She couldn't work for an investment firm, but she could consult for businesses that needed strategic development advice. She couldn't manage other people's money, but she could help companies optimize their own financial operations. Victoria's first client was a small tech startup in Boulder that was struggling to secure funding for their innovative software platform. The founders had brilliant technical skills, but no understanding of how to present their business case to investors. Working for equity instead of cash, Victoria spent 3 weeks restructuring their business plan, refining their financial projections, and coaching them through investor presentations. The startup secured $2.3 million in Series A funding, largely due to Victoria's strategic guidance. More importantly, word of her success began to spread through Colorado's growing tech community. Within 2 months, she had 3 more clients, all paying substantial consulting fees for strategic advice that was helping them achieve breakthrough results. But Victoria's true innovation came when she realized that her clients' biggest challenge wasn't just securing funding, it was understanding how to scale their operations efficiently once they had capital. Traditional business consultants offered generic advice, while financial advisors focused only on investment strategies. Victoria created a hybrid approach that combined strategic development with practical operational guidance. She called her company Apex Strategic Solutions and positioned it as a boutique consultancy that specialized in helping emerging companies bridge the gap between startup innovation and sustainable growth. Her unique background in both strategic analysis and practical business development allowed her to offer services that no other consultant could match. Working 18-hour days from her small apartment, Victoria developed methodologies for rapid business scaling that were unlike anything available in the traditional consulting market. She created financial models that could predict growth patterns with remarkable accuracy and operational frameworks that allowed small companies to expand without losing the innovation that had made them successful in the first place. The turning point came 8 months after her termination from Sterling Financial, when one of her tech startup clients was acquired by a major corporation for $47 million. Victoria's strategic guidance had been instrumental in positioning the company for acquisition, and her equity stake in the deal netted her $380,000, more money than she had ever seen in her life. But instead of using the windfall to improve her lifestyle, Victoria invested every penny back into Apex Strategic Solutions. She hired 2 junior analysts, leased professional office space in Denver's business district, and began developing the technology platform that would allow her to scale her consulting services nationally. Dr. Sarah Chen, a former professor of business strategy at the University of Chicago, joined Victoria as a senior partner after being impressed by the innovative methodologies Apex was developing. Dr. Chen brought academic credibility and a network of contacts that helped Apex attract larger, more sophisticated clients. What Victoria has created, Dr. Chen would later tell a business publication, is a completely new approach to strategic consulting that combines the analytical rigor of investment banking with the practical insights of operational management. She's not just advising companies, she's reinventing how business strategy gets implemented. By the end of her first year in business, Apex Strategic Solutions had 12 full-time employees and was generating $1.8 million in annual revenue. But more importantly, Victoria had built something that was uniquely hers, a company that reflected her values, her innovative thinking, and her commitment to helping businesses achieve sustainable success. The success of Apex allowed Victoria to begin the next phase of her plan, building the financial resources and industry credibility that would eventually allow her to return to the investment world as an owner rather than an employee. She began making strategic investments in her most successful clients, using her consulting relationships to identify companies with exceptional growth potential before they became visible to traditional investors. Her investment portfolio grew rapidly, not just because she had capital to invest, but because her unique position as both strategic advisor and investor gave her insights that pure financial analysts couldn't match. She understood not just the numbers but the operational realities that would determine whether those numbers were sustainable. 2 years after being fired from Sterling Financial Group, Victoria Martinez had built a thriving consultancy, accumulated a substantial investment portfolio, and established herself as one of the most innovative strategic advisors in the Colorado business community. The non-compete clause that was supposed to end her career had instead forced her to create something better than anything she could have achieved as someone else's employee. But Victoria's ultimate goal had never changed. She was building the resources and reputation that would eventually allow her to return to Chicago and settle accounts with Jonathan Sterling. The foundation was now in place. The real construction was about to begin. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Victoria, Sterling Financial Group was beginning to experience the consequences of the decisions that had led to her termination. The Morrison Industries acquisition, that Jonathan had pursued against her advice, was turning into exactly the disaster she had predicted, and the company was facing financial pressures that would soon force Jonathan to confront the cost of his arrogance. Chapter 3. The Expansion. 3 years after leaving Sterling Financial Group, Victoria Martinez stood in the conference room of Apex Strategic Solutions' new headquarters in downtown Denver, looking out at the Rocky Mountains while reviewing the quarterly reports that showed her company's meteoric rise. Apex now employed 43 people across offices in Denver, Austin, and Seattle, with annual revenues approaching $12 million and a client roster that included some of the fastest-growing companies in the western United States. But what made Victoria most proud wasn't the financial success, it was the culture she had built. Unlike the cutthroat environment at Sterling Financial, Apex prioritized collaboration, innovation, and genuine care for both employees and clients. Every person on her team knew their contributions were valued, and the company's success was shared through profit-sharing and equity programs that Jonathan Sterling would have considered impossibly generous. "Victoria, the Phoenix meeting went even better than we expected," announced Marcus Rodriguez, Apex's Director of Client Development, as he entered the conference room with obvious excitement. "TechFlow Industries wants to engage us for their entire expansion strategy, not just the West Coast rollout, but their plans for international markets as well." TechFlow Industries was an artificial intelligence company that had grown from a garage startup to a $200 million valuation in just 4 years, largely due to strategic guidance from Apex. The expansion contract Marcus was describing would be worth $2.8 million over 18 months, but more importantly, it would establish Apex as the go-to strategic partner for major tech companies looking to scale globally. "That's fantastic news," Victoria replied, though her mind was already moving beyond the immediate success to the larger implications. "But I want to make sure we can deliver on commitments that ambitious. International expansion is completely different from domestic growth." This attention to detail and conservative approach to promises was typical of Victoria's leadership style. She had learned from watching Jonathan Sterling's reckless overconfidence that sustainable success came from under-promising and over-delivering, not from making commitments that couldn't be kept. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had become Victoria's closest advisor and confidant, looked up from the market analysis she was reviewing. "Actually, I think this might be the perfect time to discuss something I've been researching. If we're going to be advising clients on international expansion, we should consider expanding our own investment activities." For the past year, Dr. Chen had been developing a proposal for Apex to launch its own investment fund, using the company's strategic consulting expertise to identify and nurture high-potential startups. The fund would leverage Apex's unique position as both advisor and investor, allowing them to support companies through their entire growth trajectory from startup to IPO. "The numbers are compelling," Dr. Chen continued, spreading out financial projections across the conference table. "Based on our track record with client companies, a $50 million fund could reasonably expect 18 to 22% annual returns. But more importantly, it would position us to participate in the long-term value creation that we're currently just advising on." Victoria studied the projections carefully, her analytical mind evaluating not just the financial potential, but the strategic implications. An investment fund would require raising capital from external investors, which would mean sharing control and answering to people who might not understand or support Apex's innovative approach. But it would also provide the resources to make much larger strategic investments, potentially including opportunities that might arise in more traditional financial markets. Victoria's thoughts turned, as they often did, to the unfinished business she had with Sterling Financial Group. "There's something else to consider," Victoria said, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I've been monitoring the Chicago financial market, and there are some interesting developments with mid-sized investment firms. Several companies that were thriving 5 years ago are now struggling with outdated strategies and poor management decisions." Marcus and Dr. Chen exchanged glances, recognizing the tone that Victoria used when she was developing one of her more ambitious plans. They had learned to pay attention when their CEO got that particular look in her eyes. "Are you thinking about expanding Apex into traditional financial services?" Dr. Chen asked. "I'm thinking about returning to my roots," Victoria replied, "but on my own terms this time." Over the next several hours, Victoria outlined a strategy that was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. The Apex Investment Fund would be structured not just to invest in startups, but to acquire struggling established companies that could be revitalized through Apex's strategic methodologies. The fund would specifically target mid-sized financial services firms that were facing challenges due to poor strategic decisions, outdated business models, or leadership problems. Apex would acquire these companies, implement the same innovative approaches that had made their consulting business successful, and transform struggling firms into thriving operations. It's basically applying our consulting methodologies at the ownership level, Victoria explained. Instead of just advising companies on how to improve, we would acquire them and implement the improvements ourselves. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity and revolutionary in its implications. Traditional private equity firms focused on financial engineering and cost-cutting to improve returns. Apex would focus on strategic innovation and operational excellence, creating value through genuine business improvement rather than financial manipulation. But Victoria had one specific target in mind for the fund's first major acquisition, and everyone in the room understood what it was, without her having to say it explicitly. Dr. Chen was the first to voice what they were all thinking. You want to buy Sterling Financial Group. I want to buy whatever's left of Sterling Financial Group after Jonathan Sterling finishes running it into the ground, Victoria corrected, and based on my research, that opportunity might be coming sooner than anyone expects. Victoria had been discreetly monitoring Sterling Financial's performance since her termination, watching with professional interest as the company struggled with the consequences of the strategic decisions that had led to her firing. The Morrison Industries acquisition had indeed become the disaster she had predicted, draining the company's resources and damaging its reputation with clients and investors. But the problems ran deeper than a single bad acquisition. Without Victoria's strategic insights, Sterling Financial had failed to identify and capitalize on emerging market opportunities, allowing more innovative competitors to capture market share and client relationships that Sterling had previously dominated. The fund would give us the resources to make an acquisition of that size, Dr. Chen observed, but it would also be incredibly risky. Sterling Financial is exactly the kind of struggling company we'd be targeting, but acquiring your former employer adds personal complications that could affect our judgment. That's exactly why it would work, Victoria replied. I know that company better than anyone. I understand its strengths, its weaknesses, and what it would take to fix the problems that Jonathan Sterling created. More importantly, I have unfinished business there. The meeting continued late into the evening, as the team developed detailed plans for launching the Apex Investment Fund and identifying potential acquisition targets. But everyone understood that this wasn't just about financial returns or business expansion. Victoria Martinez was preparing to return to Chicago, not as the terminated employee who had been escorted out of Sterling Financial Group's offices, but as the owner of a company that would soon have the resources to acquire firms like Sterling Financial. The foundation she had built over 3 years of careful planning and methodical growth was about to support the most ambitious project of her career, and Jonathan Sterling, who had dismissed her as an expendable employee, was about to discover that some people are much more dangerous when you push them out than when you keep them close. Chapter 4. The Opportunity. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 4 years after Victoria Martinez had been fired from Sterling Financial Group. She was in her corner office at Apex Strategic Solutions, reviewing the final documents for the launch of the Apex Investment Fund, when her assistant announced that David Kim, a managing partner at Chicago-based investment bank Morrison & Associates, was on the line requesting an urgent conversation. Victoria recognized David's name immediately. He had been a competitor during her Sterling Financial days, someone she had respected as a skilled analyst, despite working for a rival firm. But Morrison & Associates calling Apex directly was unusual enough to pique her curiosity. Victoria, David's voice carried a mixture of professional urgency and personal familiarity when she took the call. I hope you remember me from the Chicago financial community. I'm calling because we have a situation that might interest you, given your history with strategic turnarounds. I remember you, David. What kind of situation are we talking about? Sterling Financial Group is in serious trouble, David said without preamble. They're facing liquidity issues, client defections, and potential regulatory problems. Jonathan Sterling has quietly retained our firm to explore strategic options, including potential acquisition by a company with the resources and expertise to stabilize their operations. Victoria felt her pulse quicken, but kept her voice professionally neutral. That's interesting, but I'm not sure why you're calling Apex. We're a strategic consultancy, not an acquisition firm. Actually, that's not entirely true anymore, is it? David replied, with a hint of amusement. The financial community is aware that Apex has launched an investment fund specifically focused on acquiring underperforming companies in the financial services sector. Sterling Financial fits your stated acquisition criteria perfectly. Victoria was impressed, despite herself. The Apex Investment Fund had been launched only 6 weeks earlier, and they had been discreet about their specific investment focus. But the Chicago financial community was small enough that information traveled quickly among senior professionals. Assuming that's accurate, Victoria said carefully, what makes you think Sterling Financial would be interested in selling to Apex? Because they don't have any other choice, David replied bluntly. The Morrison Industries acquisition has been an unmitigated disaster, exactly as some people predicted it would be. The environmental liabilities alone have cost them $23 million so far, and the EPA investigation is just getting started. Victoria allowed herself a moment of satisfaction at this confirmation of her original analysis, but remained focused on the immediate opportunity. What's their current financial situation? They're burning through cash reserves trying to manage the Morrison cleanup while simultaneously dealing with client defections and reduced revenue. Jonathan Sterling has been trying to secure emergency funding, but potential investors are demanding oversight and control provisions that he's unwilling to accept. The irony was perfect. Jonathan Sterling, who had fired Victoria for refusing to support the Morrison acquisition, was now facing bankruptcy because he had proceeded with that exact deal against her advice. The strategic insight that he had dismissed as overly cautious would have saved his company if he had listened. David, I appreciate you thinking of Apex, but I have to ask why Morrison and Associates would recommend us as potential acquirers. Surely there are larger firms with more established track records in the Chicago market. There are, David admitted, but they're not offering what Sterling Financial really needs. The other potential acquirers want to strip the company for assets or merge it into their existing operations. Sterling Financial needs someone who understands its core business model and can preserve what works while fixing what doesn't. And you think Apex can do that? I think Victoria Martinez can do that, David said directly. Your reputation in strategic turnarounds is exceptional, and your background with Sterling Financial gives you insights that external acquirers wouldn't have. Plus, there's poetic justice in the situation that appeals to Jonathan Sterling's sense of drama. Victoria almost laughed at the idea that Jonathan Sterling was interested in poetic justice, but she recognized the strategic validity of David's argument. She did understand Sterling Financial better than any external acquirer could, and her track record with Apex demonstrated that she could successfully implement the kinds of operational improvements that Sterling Financial desperately needed. What would the timeline look like for a potential acquisition? Sterling Financial has maybe 6 months before their cash flow problems become critical, David explained. Jonathan Sterling is hoping to find a solution that allows him to maintain some control and ownership, but that's becoming less realistic as the situation deteriorates. And the price range? Based on current market conditions and the company's financial distress, we estimate the acquisition price would be in the $15 to $20 million range. For a company that was valued at $65 million 3 years ago, that represents a significant opportunity for the right buyer. Victoria's mind was already calculating the possibilities. The Apex Investment Fund had raised $75 million in capital, which meant they could easily afford to acquire Sterling Financial while maintaining reserves for operational improvements and working capital. More importantly, the acquisition would give Victoria the platform she needed to demonstrate that her strategic methodologies could revitalize even seriously distressed companies. David, I'm interested in learning more about the opportunity, Victoria said finally, but I want to be completely transparent about something. My history with Sterling Financial is complicated, and any potential acquisition would need to address that directly. Jonathan Sterling is aware that you might be involved in the process, David replied. In fact, he specifically asked me to reach out to you. I think he recognizes that his options are limited, and he's willing to work with someone he previously underestimated if it means saving the company. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, as David outlined the specific challenges Sterling Financial was facing and the timeline for potential acquisition discussions. When Victoria finally hung up, she sat quietly in her office for several minutes, processing the magnitude of the opportunity that had just presented itself. 4 years earlier, she had been escorted out of Sterling Financial Group as a terminated employee. Now, she was being invited to return as a potential owner. The company that had dismissed her as expendable was now desperately in need of exactly the kind of strategic expertise she had tried to provide when she worked there. But this wasn't just about vindication or revenge. Sterling Financial Group, despite its current problems, still had valuable assets, an established client base, experienced employees, and a business model that could be highly profitable under competent management. Acquiring the company would give Apex a platform for expanding into traditional financial services while demonstrating the effectiveness of their strategic methodologies. Victoria picked up her phone and called Dr. Sarah Chen. Sarah, we need to schedule an emergency strategy session. The opportunity we've been preparing for just presented itself. The Wheel of Fortune was about to complete its full rotation. Victoria Martinez was coming home to Chicago, but this time she would be the one making the decisions about who stayed and who went. Chapter 5. The Negotiation. Victoria Martinez returned to Chicago on a grey October morning, 4 years and 7 months after being escorted out of Sterling Financial Group's offices as a terminated employee. But this time, she walked into the downtown financial district as the CEO of a $12 million consulting firm and the managing partner of a $75 million investment fund, accompanied by a team of lawyers, accountants, and strategic advisors who represented the kind of resources that Jonathan Sterling desperately needed. The preliminary negotiations were scheduled to take place at Morrison & Associates offices, neutral ground that would allow both parties to maintain professional dignity while discussing what was essentially a rescue operation for a failing company. Victoria had spent weeks preparing for this moment, analyzing Sterling Financial's current situation, developing turnaround strategies, and most importantly, preparing herself emotionally for facing the man who had destroyed her career and inadvertently launched her transformation into something much more powerful. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had flown in from Denver to serve as Victoria's chief strategic advisor, reviewed the final negotiation parameters as their car pulled up to the Morrison & Associates building. Remember, Victoria, this isn't personal, even though it feels personal. We're here to evaluate a business opportunity, not to settle old scores. I know, Victoria replied, adjusting her tailored, charcoal suit, a far cry from the off-the-rack outfits she had worn as a Sterling Financial employee. But that doesn't mean I can't enjoy the irony of the situation. The Morrison & Associates conference room was impressive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan and furnishings that spoke of old money and established success. David Kim greeted Victoria's team professionally, but she could see the curiosity in his eyes as he observed the woman who had become something of a legend in Chicago financial circles. Jonathan Sterling arrived 20 minutes late, accompanied by his CFO and a lawyer who looked like he specialized in crisis management. At 52, Jonathan appeared older than his years, with gray hair that had thinned noticeably and stress lines that told the story of a man who had watched his life's work crumble due to his own poor decisions. When Jonathan entered the conference room and saw Victoria sitting at the negotiation table, his expression cycled through surprise, discomfort, and finally resignation. Whatever arrogance had characterized his personality during her employment had been tempered by 4 years of watching his company deteriorate while his former employee built a business empire. "Victoria," Jonathan said simply, extending his hand in a gesture that seemed more diplomatic than friendly. "Thank you for considering this opportunity." "Jonathan," Victoria replied, shaking his hand with professional courtesy while maintaining direct eye contact. "I understand Sterling Financial is facing some challenges. The understatement was deliberate and pointed. Sterling Financial wasn't just facing challenges. It was 6 months away from bankruptcy due to a series of strategic decisions that Victoria had opposed when she worked there. David Kim facilitated the initial presentations, with Jonathan's team outlining Sterling Financial's current assets, liabilities, and operational challenges. The numbers were worse than Victoria had expected. The Morrison Industries acquisition had cost the company $31 million in cleanup costs so far, with no end in sight. Client defections had reduced annual revenue by 40% over the past 2 years. Employee turnover was approaching 60% as talented professionals fled to more stable firms. But Victoria could see past the immediate problems to the underlying value that still existed. Sterling Financial's brand was damaged, but not destroyed. They still held licenses and regulatory approvals that would be expensive and time-consuming for a new firm to obtain. Most importantly, about 60% of their original client base remained loyal, representing relationships that could be rebuilt with proper management. The core question, Victoria said when Jonathan's presentation concluded, is whether Sterling Financial's problems are fundamental or operational. If the business model itself is flawed, then acquisition doesn't make sense for anyone. But if the problems stem from poor strategic decisions and inadequate management, then there's significant potential for recovery. The comment was diplomatically phrased but unmistakably pointed. Everyone in the room understood that Victoria was referencing the specific strategic decisions, particularly the Morrison acquisition, that she had opposed during her employment. Jonathan's CFO, a nervous man named Robert Chen, who had been hired after Victoria's departure, attempted to defend the company's recent performance. While it's true that the Morrison acquisition has been more challenging than anticipated, the underlying strategic logic was sound. The environmental issues were impossible to predict. Victoria opened her laptop and displayed a document that she had prepared specifically for this moment. Actually, Robert, the environmental issues were entirely predictable. I conducted a comprehensive analysis of Morrison Industries in 2019 and identified $40,060 million in potential environmental liabilities based on their manufacturing history and regulatory compliance records. The silence that followed was profound. Jonathan Sterling stared at the screen displaying Victoria's original analysis, the same analysis he had dismissed as overly cautious before firing her for refusing to support the acquisition. "You still had this analysis?" Jonathan asked quietly. "I keep detailed records of all my strategic recommendations," Victoria replied. "It's a professional habit. That has served me well." Dr. Sarah Chen, recognizing that the emotional undercurrents were threatening to overwhelm the business discussion, redirected the conversation toward practical matters. "Given Sterling Financial's current situation, what are you hoping to achieve through a potential acquisition?" Jonathan's lawyer answered first, outlining terms that would allow Jonathan to retain 25% ownership and continue as CEO under the new ownership structure. But Victoria could see from his body language that Jonathan understood these terms were unrealistic, given his company's desperate situation. "Let me be direct about Apex's position," Victoria said, taking control of the negotiation. "Sterling Financial needs approximately $20 million in immediate capital to stabilize operations and address the Morrison liabilities. It needs comprehensive strategic restructuring to rebuild client relationships and restore profitability. Most importantly, it needs management leadership that can make difficult decisions without letting ego interfere with business judgment." The implications were clear. Jonathan Sterling had proven that he lacked the judgment and leadership skills necessary to rescue his own company. "What are you proposing?" Jonathan asked, his voice carrying the resignation of a man who understood that his options were limited. Victoria outlined Apex's offer, a complete acquisition of Sterling Financial for $18 million, with Jonathan receiving a consulting contract that would allow him to transition clients and maintain relationships while new management took operational control. Current employees would be evaluated individually, with job security based on performance and cultural fit rather than tenure or politics. "You're asking me to sell my life's work," Jonathan said, though without the anger Victoria might have expected. "I'm offering to save your life's work," Victoria corrected. "Sterling Financial can either be acquired by Apex and rebuilt into a thriving company, or it can continue on its current trajectory and disappear entirely within 6 months. The negotiation continued for another 3 hours, with lawyers and accountants working through details while the principals discussed broader strategic questions. But the fundamental dynamics were clear. Victoria held all the leverage, and Jonathan Sterling's only choice was between accepting her terms or watching his company collapse completely. As the meeting concluded with an agreement to continue discussions the following week, Jonathan approached Victoria privately. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, "not just for firing you, but for not listening to your analysis of Morrison Industries. You were right, and I was wrong." Victoria studied the man who had once been her mentor and had become her adversary. She could see genuine remorse in his expression, but also the exhaustion of someone who had learned difficult lessons too late to save what he had built. "Jonathan, mistakes are only valuable if we learn from them," she replied. "The question now is whether you're willing to support what needs to be done to fix the problems those mistakes created." As Victoria left the Morrison & Associates building that evening, she reflected on how much had changed since her termination 4 years earlier. She had returned to Chicago not seeking revenge, but offering redemption for Jonathan Sterling, for his employees, and for the company that had shaped her early career. But redemption would come on her terms, with her leadership, and according to her vision of what Sterling Financial could become under competent management. Chapter 6. The Acquisition. The final acquisition meeting took place on a snowy December morning in the conference room of Sterling Financial Group's offices, the same building where Victoria Martinez had been terminated 4 years earlier. As she walked through the familiar hallways, accompanied by her legal team and strategic advisors, Victoria felt a complex mixture of satisfaction, sadness, and determination. The offices looked tired and worn compared to her memories, with several empty desks where employees had once worked and a general atmosphere of decline that spoke to the company's struggling finances. But Victoria could see past the current problems to the potential that still existed within these walls. Jonathan Sterling was waiting in the conference room with his remaining senior staff, looking like a man who had accepted that he was about to sign away control of everything he had built. The acquisition documents were spread across the mahogany table, the same table where he had presented Victoria with her termination papers 48 months earlier. "Before we proceed with the formal signing," Victoria said, addressing the assembled group, "I want everyone to understand what this acquisition means and what changes will occur immediately." She opened her laptop and displayed a comprehensive presentation that outlined Apex's plans for Sterling Financial's transformation. The strategy was ambitious but realistic. Immediate capital injection to stabilize operations, systematic rebuilding of client relationships, implementation of modern technology platforms, and most importantly, a complete cultural transformation that would prioritize competence and integrity over politics and ego. Every current employee will be evaluated based on their skills, performance, and cultural fit with Apex's values, Victoria explained. "This isn't about punishment or revenge. It's about building the strongest possible team to restore Sterling Financial to profitability and growth." Robert Chen, the CFO who had been hired after Victoria's departure, raised his hand nervously. "What about existing management contracts and employment agreements?" "All existing contracts will be honored through appropriate transition periods," Victoria replied. "But continuing employment will be based on merit and contribution to the company's success, not on previous tenure or relationships." The message was clear without being harsh. Competent employees who could contribute to the company's recovery would be retained and rewarded, while those who had contributed to its decline would be replaced. Jonathan Sterling signed the acquisition documents with steady hands, though Victoria could see the emotion in his eyes as he transferred ownership of his life's work to the woman he had once dismissed as expendable. "Victoria," Jonathan said as he completed the final signatures, "I want you to know that despite everything that happened between us, I genuinely hope you succeed in rebuilding this company. The employees who remain deserve better leadership than I was able to provide." It was the closest thing to a complete admission of failure that Victoria had ever heard from Jonathan, and she recognized the courage it took for him to acknowledge his mistakes so directly. "Thank you, Jonathan," she replied. "I appreciate your willingness to support the transition process." Sterling Financial has valuable assets and talented people. It just needs better strategic direction. The formal acquisition ceremony concluded with handshakes and legal formalities, but the real work would begin immediately. Victoria had prepared a comprehensive 90-day turnaround plan that would address the company's most critical challenges while laying the foundation for long-term growth. Her first act as owner and CEO was to call an all-hands meeting for that afternoon, where she would address the remaining employees directly and outline her vision for the company's future. At 3 p.m., Victoria stood before the assembled staff of Sterling Financial Group, many of whom remembered her as the rising star who had been suddenly terminated 4 years earlier. The confusion and curiosity in their faces was evident as they tried to process the dramatic reversal of fortune that had brought their former colleague back as their new owner. "I know this situation is unusual," Victoria began, "and I want to address it directly. 4 years ago, I was terminated from this company for opposing strategic decisions that I believed would damage Sterling Financial's long-term prospects. Today, I'm returning as owner because those decisions have indeed damaged the company exactly as I predicted they would." She paused to let the implications sink in, then continued with characteristic directness. "But I'm not here to relitigate past decisions or assign blame. I'm here to build something better than what existed before, a company that combines strategic innovation with operational excellence, where the best ideas win regardless of who proposes them." Victoria outlined her immediate priorities: stabilizing the company's finances, rebuilding client relationships, modernizing technology infrastructure, and most importantly, creating a culture where employees felt valued and empowered to contribute their best work. "Over the next 90 days, every aspect of our operations will be evaluated and improved," she explained. "This will involve difficult changes, but also significant opportunities for those who embrace our new direction." The questions that followed revealed both skepticism and hope among the staff. Several employees who had worked with Victoria during her previous tenure expressed enthusiasm about her return, while others seemed concerned about job security and the pace of change she was proposing. Sarah Martinez, a senior analyst who had been one of Victoria's closest colleagues, raised her hand. "Victoria, what assurances can you give us about employment stability during this transition?" "I can assure you that every employment decision will be based on merit, performance, and cultural fit," Victoria replied. "Employees who contribute to our success will find significant opportunities for advancement and increased responsibility. Those who don't will be transitioned out professionally and respectfully." The meeting concluded with Victoria inviting individual conversations with any employee who wanted to discuss their role in the company's future. Over the following week, she conducted dozens of one-on-one meetings that gave her detailed insights into the company's operational challenges and cultural problems. What she discovered was both encouraging and troubling. Many of the company's most talented employees had indeed left during the past 2 years, frustrated by poor leadership and strategic confusion. But those who remained included several exceptional professionals who had stayed out of loyalty to their colleagues and clients rather than confidence in management. Most importantly, Victoria identified a core group of about 15 employees who could form the foundation of Sterling Financial's rebuilt leadership team. These were people who had maintained their professional standards despite working in a declining environment, and who showed enthusiasm for the kind of innovative approaches that had made Apex Strategic Solutions successful. 2 weeks after the acquisition, Victoria announced her new management structure. Sarah Martinez was promoted to Chief Operating Officer, responsible for implementing operational improvements and client relationship management. Michael Torres, a talented analyst who had been underutilized under the previous management, became Director of Strategic Development. Dr. Sarah Chen relocated from Denver to serve as Chief Strategy Officer, bringing Apex's methodologies directly into Sterling Financial's operations. But perhaps the most symbolic change was Victoria's decision to renovate the executive offices, removing the hierarchical barriers that had characterized Jonathan Sterling's leadership style. Instead of a corner office that isolated the CEO from daily operations, Victoria created an open workspace that encouraged collaboration and accessible leadership. 3 months after the acquisition, Sterling Financial Group was beginning to show signs of the transformation that Victoria had promised. Client retention had stabilized, new business development was showing positive results, and employee morale had improved dramatically under leadership that valued competence over politics. The Morrison Industries cleanup was finally nearing completion, with costs contained at $34 million, significantly less than the $50–60 million Victoria's original analysis had predicted, thanks to more aggressive negotiation with environmental contractors and regulatory agencies. But the real transformation was cultural. Sterling Financial was becoming the kind of company that Victoria had always envisioned, a place where strategic innovation was rewarded, where the best ideas were implemented regardless of their source, and where employees felt empowered to contribute their expertise without fear of political retaliation. Standing in her new office 4 months after the acquisition, looking out at Lake Michigan through windows that had once belonged to Jonathan Sterling, Victoria reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her full circle. She had been fired from this company as an expendable employee, but she had returned as an owner with the resources and expertise to transform it into something better than it had ever been before. The revenge was complete, but it had taken a form that no one could have predicted. Instead of destroying Sterling Financial Group, Victoria Martinez had saved it. Chapter 7. The Vindication. 1 year after acquiring Sterling Financial Group, Victoria Martinez stood on the stage of the Chicago Business Forum's annual conference, looking out at an audience of 500 business leaders, investors, and entrepreneurs who had gathered to hear her keynote speech about strategic turnarounds and corporate transformation. The irony was not lost on her that many of the people in the audience had written off both her career and Sterling Financial just 18 months earlier. The title of her presentation was From Termination to Transformation: How Strategic Vision Can Resurrect Failing Companies, and the case study she would be discussing was the remarkable recovery of Sterling Financial Group under Apex's ownership and her leadership. 18 months ago, Victoria began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system, Sterling Financial Group was facing bankruptcy due to poor strategic decisions, inadequate leadership, and a corporate culture that prioritized politics over performance. Today, it's one of the fastest-growing financial services firms in the Midwest, with client satisfaction ratings that exceed industry averages and employee retention that rivals the best companies in our sector. The transformation had been even more dramatic than Victoria had originally projected. Sterling Financial's revenue had increased by 180% over the past year, driven by a combination of client retention, new business development, and strategic acquisitions of smaller firms that complemented their core services. The company now employed 78 people, compared to the 32 who had remained when Victoria acquired it, but the numbers only told part of the story. The real transformation had been cultural, with Sterling Financial evolving from a declining company characterized by fear and political maneuvering into a dynamic organization where innovation was rewarded and the best ideas were implemented regardless of their source. The key to successful corporate turnarounds, Victoria continued, is understanding that most business failures are not caused by external market forces or competitive pressures. They're caused by internal failures of leadership, strategy, and culture that prevent organizations from adapting to changing conditions. In the audience, Jonathan Sterling sat in the back row, listening to his former employee describe the transformation of his former company with a mixture of pride and regret. The consulting contract that Victoria had offered him as part of the acquisition had evolved into a genuine advisory relationship, with Jonathan providing historical context and client relationship insights that supported Sterling Financial's recovery. The relationship between Victoria and Jonathan had surprised everyone, including themselves. What had begun as a professional necessity had evolved into something approaching mutual respect, as Jonathan acknowledged the mistakes that had led to his company's decline, while Victoria recognized the foundational strengths that had made the turnaround possible. One of the most important lessons from Sterling Financial's transformation, Victoria explained to the audience, is that sustainable success requires leaders who can separate their ego from their judgment. Companies fail when decision-makers prioritize being right over being effective. The comment was pointed, but not cruel, and Jonathan nodded slightly in acknowledgement of the leadership failures that had nearly destroyed his life's work. Victoria's presentation continued for 45 minutes, during which she outlined the specific methodologies that Apex had used to transform Sterling Financial from a failing company into an industry leader. But she also discussed the broader lessons about strategic thinking, corporate culture, and leadership that applied to any organization facing significant challenges. The question and answer session that followed was lively and substantive, with audience members wanting to understand the details of how such a dramatic transformation had been achieved in such a short time frame. "Ms. Martinez," asked Patricia Williams, the CEO of a major logistics company, "what advice would you give to leaders who are facing strategic challenges but aren't sure whether their problems are operational or fundamental?" "The most important thing is to seek objective analysis from people who aren't invested in defending previous decisions," Victoria replied. "Often organizations have employees who understand exactly what's wrong and how to fix it, but they've been discouraged from speaking up because their insights challenge existing leadership or strategy." The answer drew knowing nods from several audience members who had experienced similar situations in their own organizations. David Kim, the investment banker who had facilitated the Sterling Financial acquisition, raised his hand during the final minutes of the Q&A session. "Victoria, when you were fired from Sterling Financial 4 years ago, did you envision that you would eventually return as the company's owner?" Victoria smiled at the question, which captured the dramatic arc of her professional journey. "Honestly, David, when I was terminated, I was focused on survival rather than revenge, but I did promise myself that I would prove the value of the strategic insights that had been dismissed. I just never imagined that proof would take the form of actually owning the company that rejected those insights." The audience laughed appreciatively, recognizing the poetic justice of Victoria's story, while also understanding the serious business lessons it contained. After the presentation concluded, Victoria was surrounded by business leaders who wanted to discuss potential consulting relationships, investment opportunities, and strategic partnerships. The success of Sterling Financial's turnaround had established Victoria and Apex as leading experts in corporate transformation, with a client waiting list that extended 6 months into the future. But perhaps the most meaningful conversation came when Jonathan Sterling approached her as the crowd was dispersing. "Victoria, I wanted to thank you for how you characterized my role in today's presentation," he said quietly. "You could have used this platform to humiliate me publicly, but instead you focused on the lessons, rather than the failures." "Jonathan, humiliating you wouldn't have served any purpose beyond satisfying my ego," Victoria replied. "What matters is that Sterling Financial is thriving and that other companies can learn from both our mistakes and our successes." "There's something else I want to tell you," Jonathan continued. "Watching you rebuild the company over the past year has been one of the most educational experiences of my career. I've learned more about effective leadership from observing your methods than I did in 20 years of running my own company." The admission was remarkable, coming from a man who had once been so confident in his own judgment that he had fired his most talented employee for disagreeing with him. "We all make mistakes," Victoria said graciously. "The key is learning from them and using those lessons to make better decisions in the future." As Victoria left the conference that evening, she reflected on how completely her life had been transformed. Since that devastating day, when she had been escorted out of Sterling Financial's offices, she had returned not just as the owner of that company, but as a recognized leader in her industry, and an example of how strategic thinking and persistent effort could overcome even the most challenging setbacks. The girl who had been fired for being too cautious had become the woman who saved a company by implementing exactly the kind of cautious strategic analysis that her former boss had rejected. But, beyond the personal vindication, Victoria had proven something more important: that businesses could be both profitable and principled, that success could be achieved through competence rather than politics, and that the best leaders were those who empowered others to contribute their expertise rather than demanding blind loyalty to flawed strategies. Standing outside the conference center, looking up at the Chicago skyline that had once seemed so intimidating when she was struggling to rebuild her career, Victoria felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond financial success or professional recognition. She had not just gotten her old job back, she had created something better, than her old job had ever been. Chapter 8. The Legacy. 5 years after acquiring Sterling Financial Group, Victoria Martinez sat in her downtown Chicago office reviewing the annual report that would be distributed to investors, employees, and industry analysts the following week. The numbers told a story that would have seemed impossible when she first returned to the struggling company. Sterling Financial had grown from a near-bankrupt firm with $12 million in annual revenue to a thriving organization generating $85 million annually, with offices in Chicago, Milwaukee, and Kansas City. But what made Victoria most proud wasn't the financial growth. It was the culture she had built. Sterling Financial had become known throughout the industry as a company where talent was recognized and rewarded regardless of background, where strategic innovation was encouraged at every level, and where ethical business practices were considered just as important as profitability. Dr. Sarah Chen knocked on Victoria's office door, carrying a folder that contained the latest client satisfaction surveys and employee engagement metrics. As Chief Strategy Officer, Sarah had been instrumental in implementing the methodologies that had transformed Sterling Financial from a failing company into an industry leader. "Victoria, I wanted to share the latest survey results with you before the board meeting," Sarah said, settling into one of the comfortable chairs across from Victoria's desk. "Client satisfaction is at 94%, which is the highest in our industry segment. But more importantly, employee engagement is at 91%, and voluntary turnover is only 8%. These metrics represented more than just positive business outcomes. They reflected the kind of workplace that Victoria had always envisioned creating. Employees at Sterling Financial knew their contributions were valued, their ideas were heard, and their professional growth was supported by leadership that genuinely cared about their success. Those numbers prove that doing business the right way is also the most profitable way," Victoria replied. "When employees feel valued and clients trust our expertise, sustainable growth follows naturally." The conversation was interrupted by Victoria's assistant, who announced that Jonathan Sterling had arrived for their monthly advisory meeting. Over the past 2 years, Jonathan's consulting relationship with the company had evolved into something approaching a genuine partnership, with his historical knowledge and client relationships complementing Victoria's strategic leadership. Jonathan entered the office looking healthier and more energetic than he had in years. At 57, he had discovered that being freed from the stress of trying to manage a failing company had allowed him to rediscover his original passion for financial analysis and client service. "Victoria, Sarah," Jonathan greeted them warmly, "I wanted to update you on the Milwaukee expansion progress before we dive into the quarterly review." The Milwaukee office, which had opened 18 months earlier, was already exceeding its business plan projections by 40%. The success reflected Sterling Financial's systematic approach to expansion, careful market analysis, gradual scaling, and most importantly, replication of the company culture that had made the Chicago office so successful. "The Milwaukee team has identified 3 potential acquisition targets that could accelerate our growth in the Wisconsin market," Jonathan continued, "but they're all requesting meetings with you personally before they'll consider serious negotiations." Victoria smiled at this development, which had become increasingly common as her reputation in the industry had grown. Business owners who were considering selling their companies wanted to meet with Victoria directly, recognizing that her approach to acquisitions prioritized preserving what worked rather than simply cutting costs to improve profitability. "I'm happy to meet with any serious candidates," Victoria replied, "but I want to make sure we're not growing faster than we can maintain our culture and service quality." This conservative approach to expansion was characteristic of Victoria's leadership style. She had learned from Jonathan's mistakes at the original Sterling Financial that rapid growth without proper foundation could destroy even the most promising business. The discussion continued for an hour, covering everything from potential acquisitions to new service offerings to long-term strategic planning. But the most significant agenda item was an opportunity that could transform Sterling Financial from a regional success story into a national industry leader. "Victoria," Sarah said, "we've received a formal inquiry from Meridian Capital Group about acquiring Sterling Financial. The preliminary offer is $340 million, which would represent a 1,800% return on Apex's original investment. Meridian Capital Group was one of the largest financial services companies in the United States, with operations across 48 states and international offices in 12 countries. Being acquired by Meridian would provide Sterling Financial's employees with unprecedented career opportunities and give their clients access to resources and capabilities that no regional firm could match. But Victoria's expression showed more concern than excitement about the opportunity. What would acquisition by Meridian mean for our employees and our company culture? That's the crucial question, Sarah admitted. Meridian has a reputation for successful acquisitions, but they also have a very different corporate culture than what we've built here. They prioritize efficiency and standardization over the kind of personalized service and innovative thinking that has made us successful. Jonathan, who had experienced firsthand what happened when business decisions were driven by financial metrics rather than strategic wisdom, offered his perspective. Victoria, this is exactly the kind of decision that I failed to make correctly when I was running this company. The question isn't whether the offer is financially attractive, it's whether the acquisition would preserve or destroy what you've built here. Victoria appreciated Jonathan's insight, which reflected the hard-earned wisdom that had come from watching his own company nearly collapse due to poor strategic decisions. The offer is generous, Victoria said thoughtfully, but money has never been the primary motivation for what we're doing here. We've built something special, a company where people genuinely enjoy their work, where clients receive exceptional service, and where doing business ethically is considered just as important as generating profits. She stood up and walked to the window that overlooked Lake Michigan, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 8 years earlier, she had been a terminated employee with no clear future. Now, she was being offered a financial windfall that would make her independently wealthy for life. But Victoria had learned that true success wasn't measured only in financial terms. It was measured by the impact you had on other people's lives, the legacy you built, and the positive changes you created in the world around you. I'm going to decline Meridian's offer, Victoria announced, turning back to face Sarah and Jonathan. Sterling Financial is more valuable as an independent company that can continue growing according to our own values and vision. Sarah and Jonathan exchanged glances, both recognizing the significance of Victoria's decision. Turning down $340 million required the kind of confidence and principled leadership that was rare in the business world. There is one thing I want to discuss, though, Victoria continued. I think it's time to implement the employee ownership program we've been planning. If Meridian sees value in acquiring us, then our employees should have the opportunity to share in that value as owners, rather than just employees. The employee ownership program was something Victoria had been developing for months, a way to gradually transfer significant ownership stakes to Sterling Financial's employees, ensuring that the people who had contributed to the company's success would benefit from its continued growth. The program would give every employee equity stakes based on their tenure, performance, and contribution to our success, Victoria explained. Over time, Sterling Financial would become a genuinely employee-owned company, with financial success shared among everyone who helps create it. The concept was revolutionary in the financial services industry, where ownership was typically concentrated among a small group of senior partners. But Victoria had learned from her own experience that employees who felt genuinely valued and empowered produced better results than those who were simply working for salaries. 6 months later, Victoria stood before Sterling Financial's assembled employees to announce the implementation of the ownership program. The reaction was everything she had hoped for: excitement, gratitude, and renewed commitment to the company's continued success. This ownership program reflects something fundamental about our values, Victoria told the group. We believe that the people who create value should share in that value, and that the best companies are built by employees who think like owners because they actually are owners. As the meeting concluded and employees returned to their work with obvious enthusiasm, Victoria reflected on how far they had all come since that devastating day when she had been fired from this same company. She had returned not seeking revenge but offering redemption for herself, for Jonathan Sterling, and for every employee who had been trapped in a failing organization. The transformation had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, creating not just financial success, but a model for how businesses could operate according to principles that benefited everyone involved. Standing in the office that had once belonged to the man who fired her, looking out at a company that now belonged to the people who made it successful, Victoria Martinez understood that she had achieved something more valuable than wealth or recognition. She had proven that doing business the right way was not just the ethical choice, it was the most effective choice. And in the process, she had created a legacy that would outlast any individual success or failure. The millionaire who had fired her years ago had inadvertently given her the greatest gift possible, the motivation to build something better than anything he had ever imagined. What an incredible journey we've witnessed together, from that devastating moment when Victoria was fired from Sterling Financial Group to watching her transform that same company into an industry-leading organization where she implemented employee ownership and ethical business practices. This story proves that sometimes the worst thing that happens to us can become the catalyst for the best thing we ever achieve. Victoria's transformation from terminated employee to company owner shows us that with strategic thinking, unwavering determination, and the courage to build something better than what came before, we can turn our greatest setbacks into our most meaningful victories. But perhaps even more importantly, her decision to share ownership with her employees demonstrates that true success means lifting others up along the way. If this story inspired you as much as it inspired me, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. For more incredible stories of triumph and transformation, share this video with someone who needs to remember that their current situation doesn't define their destiny. And remember, your comeback story might be closer than you think. What are you building that could change everything?